Hey there, everyone. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is a special YouTube exclusive episode on the finale of Game of Thrones. We were asked to talk about Game of Thrones, the finale and the whole show and everything. And, you know, it was a big pop culture thing. And we were kind of waiting, I think, for tempers to cool down.
Well, I was super reluctant to talk about Game of Thrones in any capacity in those last few weeks because the conversation around the show was just dominated by overwhelming negativity, near unanimous negativity.
I would be even more so in that it was just that lines in the sand had been drawn at that point. It didn't matter what was actually going on with the show.
I would agree. I think as soon as somebody kind of introduces a narrative that people can latch onto about how we're supposed to feel about a thing, you know, if it's got enough sort of cultural attractiveness, then yeah, people will sort of dogpile on it. It happened with those early sort of DC extended universe movies. There was this big narrative that they were all bad, and you know, what was going to be the one movie to save the DCEU? Well, it's like that's not how that really works. And it's, you know, we see something similar right now with video game movies. People are constantly wondering, will this be the video game movie that breaks the curse? It's just a very dumb way to view things. And it's like what happened with Shyamalan, too. You know, it's that growing trend of, oh, his movies are getting worse and worse and worse. And I've seen Last Airbender now, and I've seen After Earth now, and they ain't nearly as bad as people say they are. In fact, they're pretty interesting movies. They're not good movies, but they're pretty interesting.
Well, I think like you're saying, you know, narrative, like that's what the last season of Game of Thrones, by the time it came around, and I would say specifically after starting and everything after the third episode, I think it was called The Long Night.
Season 8, the Winterfell episode you're talking about?
Whatever the fighting the army of the dead one.
Yeah, I think that's The Long Night. It's the one where they fight off the army of the dead at Winterfell.
Yes, which has obviously been this big culminating thing. Well, before we get into that, I do think we should put this on the table. Travis and I have not. I read the first Game of Thrones book, and it was not for me. Like, so we have no attachment to the written material. We're just watching this as a show, as a piece of pop culture. And to be frank, I would say that you and I, after a certain point, I couldn't pinpoint where, but I think you and I became pretty, I don't want to say disinterested, because obviously we were doing, you know, keep watching it. But I think at some point, Game of Thrones kind of felt like a pop culture obligation to us.
It did feel like an obligation, but that is sort of by design. People like serialized stories because they feel like they have to show up for the next installment. It is this big social experience that we all take part in, that we're all buzzing about at the water cooler the next day. It is addictive. In that way, it's kind of designed to be dissatisfying by design, because we wonder what's going to happen next and how they're going to pull something out of a tailspin. And usually that tailspin is intentional. And this is what happened with, you know, serials in front of movies at movie theaters, old serials. It's like, you know, in this one at the end of it, guy falls off a cliff. What are they going to do? Oh no. Now that it's done, I feel relieved. I like endings. I like knowing things are over and that we can move on. But I think people are having a lot of difficulty with that.
Well, you and I, even before the season aired, we already said like, oh, everybody's going to hate this season because it's an ending.
Yeah.
And we have talked about how we as a pop culture approach the idea of endings to things that we have found beloved. And it's one of the reasons why I've been doing Third Time's the Charm with Danielle, is that a lot of third movies are often viewed as the ending of a trilogy, and that changes the narrative around them. And it usually sets them up for some kind of failure.
Right.
And by no fault of their own.
I think people are very hesitant to love a final installment. And I think there's some really basic psychological reasons for that. Number one, people want to distance themselves so that they're not hurt. Because the pain of saying goodbye to something you love is often extraordinarily painful. So people tend to sort of disconnect, and they think, it's the ending. It's not going to be that great. So they tend to sort of distance themselves from it. They want to recognize what's bad, because that's like, having a crush on somebody, and then you're so madly infatuated with somebody, and then you find one little negative thing and you go, this is what allows me to detach from it. And so you can have that goodbye and you can let it go out of your life. And sure, there's anger, but the anger can take place of the pain you felt by, that detachment and saying goodbye lovingly. There's also a cultural narrative here based on psychology that Chernobyl, the HBO miniseries, talked about. People want somebody to blame. Usually in disasters, the investigation stops too early because people find somebody to blame and they are satisfied. But that is usually not enough to explain why something happened or how it happened. And people, of course, want to blame who they perceive to have authorial control. In this case, it's David Benioff and D.B. Weiss.
Yes, and I know there's, arguments to be made against them in terms of former work or a lack of former work, but I have to say that I think a lot of the criticisms that I've seen lobbed at this final season have way more to do with less about what actually happens in the show and more so about this thing where when people stick with something for so long, they are, even if they don't know it, writing their own finales. And when something happens in a long-running story that completely breaks from anything that resembles the finale they have created in their minds, even unwillingly. I mean, people actually do that, through fan fiction and theorizing and blah, blah. But I think just even casual expectation, you kind of think like, well, Danny's going to be okay. Nothing more specific than that. But I think so when she's not by the end of I guess we should say, obviously spoilers for all this. When those things change, it feels like a betrayal of something that you've committed yourself to for so long.
It's a betrayal of something you love. And it's not just a matter of loving the show. With these long-running shows, people develop what we call parasocial relationships with the characters. They love these characters as if they were their friends. And this is something that happens naturally as part of human psychology. People build parasocial relationships with YouTubers, with celebrities, people they don't know personally, but whose futures they are deeply invested in.
And what's interesting to me about the final season of Game of Thrones is just how much consciously it was reflecting upon its first season and how it was clearly taking inspiration from things that were right there from the beginning. And in that regard, I don't think a lot, I actually have a problem in that I didn't think a lot of the final stretch of Game of Thrones was that surprising.
No, a lot of it kind of seemed inevitable. I think partially because one of the engines of the story in Game of Thrones is prophecy. The stallion who mounts the world and Azor Ahai, all that kind of stuff. So
all that stuff,
yeah, which is traditional for fantasy story. But I think one of the reasons people fell in love with Game of Thrones and its characters is that it kind of bucked tradition in some really fascinating ways, particularly early on. It was very clear when you were watching Game of Thrones in its early seasons that this was not some fairy tale type lore story. It had elements of that, but it was a pretty gritty look at what it would be like to live in this fantasy land. Excessively gritty sometimes.
Yes, I'll agree with that. But I think what really caught on with the cultural narrative of the show was the idea that no one is safe and that people who would typically be heroes in this kind of a story are the most likely to fall victim to either death or corruption.
Yeah, because they're too good for the world.
Either they're too good for the world, or it's a matter of anybody who is in power is going to be corrupt in some way, be it the most despicable, or even if they are kind of likable. Everybody is only looking after their own self-interest. Where Game of Thrones went in its final season all played into the kind of thematics I thought the show was dealing with, but it felt a little like the surprise was gone. Like the idea of Dany burning down everything. I can't really jive with the people who are angry about that because they loved Dany and wanted her to be, this savior hero and stuff. I was like, that's not surprising. It's just not surprising to me. So it's not interesting dramatically.
Well, I think people got used to the idea of Daenerys Targaryen as a conqueror of immoral systems. She wants to break the wheel. And so she's driven by a sense of personal morality, because it's pretty clear that she is a person who has overcome tremendous opposition and been treated like shit, and she deserves better treatment. The fairy tale aspect of Daenerys' character is that she comes from a lineage of crazy people, which talks about destiny and inevitability. Is she destined to be crazy? I would argue that the series eventually just says yes, but what it failed to do was make us believe her change from the Daenerys Targaryen that we trust into this crazy person.
I disagree. I think that final season, while it was the one problem, common criticism that I do agree with, is that shortening the episode orders and having to kind of make every episode feel like an event episode, I think that hurt the storytelling
big time.
That was my one big complaint. I'm like, I buy from what I've seen in these few episodes that Dany will go down this path, but it was all like, it was like the bullet points Cliff Notes version of that journey.
Sure. I mean, it was sort of foretold that she would go down this path. They were foreshadowing it all season. It still doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And the thing that they failed to explain, in my opinion, is the loss of a moral center for Daenerys. It is pretty clear that she has a moral center through all of her arc, except in this last season. She just loses it. And the explanation is, well, she's finally snapped because she's a Targaryen.
I mean, there's stuff that they do in terms of, her continuing to lose people that she loves and her dragons and feeling, ostracized and finally getting to the place that she wanted to be and, not feeling that anybody embraces her like they do people like Jon and stuff like that. But again, these were things that should have been expanded upon and sold better over a lengthier period of time,
right,
which is what Game of Thrones also became notable for doing.
Right. It should have been noted that she fed on the adoration of these populations that she supposedly, liberated, whether they be...
Yeah, which is in previous seasons, but in the final season, it just all felt so expedited. So yeah, I see the path and I see why it would make sense, but it all just felt very on fast forward. And again, my other big complaint is that because the episode order was shortened, Game of Thrones kind of became notorious for having event episodes in a season. It would be a big battle, or a big something, be it a finale or whatever. Mm-hmm. Usually it was their penultimate episodes.
Hard Home, the Castle Black episode where Ygritte bites it. Yeah.
Right. Battle of the Bastards, all that stuff.
Sure.
And season 8 was the first time where it felt like, for the most part, every episode was trying to be the equivalent of that.
Yeah. I think there were two or three of the episodes were basically all set up for the big thing, but they still felt like blockbuster cinema. The
actual burning of King's Landing cinematically, I think was directed very well, but for the the long night and a lot of the other stuff, I just didn't feel that cinematically it was super interesting.
The Long Night rather, is one of the worst Miguel Sapochnik episodes because it's lit like crap. I'm sorry if ever, even Stephen King was telling people to shut up about complaining about the show's poor lighting. I'm sorry, but no, that episode was lit like shit. And it comes from a legacy of episodes that were lit way too dimly in the show. And there are plenty of people who are just like, what are you talking about? It's not. No, probably what happened is that you noticed Game of Thrones was looking a little dark and you thought, oh, my TV, why is my TV so dark? I better adjust the brightness on my TV. The problem was never your TV, friend. It's the fucking show.
There's so many factors into that. It's not just how they lit it on set, but all of the post-production that goes in to adjusting the image in terms of lighting and contrast and all these things. No matter, like we said, we can't just find one person to point the finger at. It's a litany of failures. That is a failure. Mm-hmm. And I remember and it's unfortunate because I know that has been built up as, the big thing. It's the fight against the White Walkers. But even though that is the first scene in the series of what it's, the big conflict it's setting up, that was never what interested me about the show.
No, the show was at its best when it was doing the political intrigue stuff in hushed conversations in hallways. And because the show thrived on that stuff dramatically, the show fell into a directorial groove or an artistic groove through most of it that allowed it to be pretty mundane in the way that it was shot. I mean, certainly there were action scenes and effect scenes that stood out, but I think the show kind of became directed by algorithm at a certain point. Like every episode looked the same. Like if it wasn't a huge blockbuster episode, then it was just like, I don't understand why all this direction is so artless and so literal. Like it seemed to really just take everything entirely literally and really had zero artistic flair in the direction. One of the positive changes that they made for this final season is that they actually managed to find images that were compelling and beautifully lit and stick with them. Like that finale episode is one of the best episodes cinematographically that the series has ever had.
I mean, I'm assuming you're saying that because it found strong singular images.
Yes, and it framed them well. And while they were very obvious, like the dragon wings rising up behind Daenerys, the rest of the show really hadn't been doing that kind of stuff. It was really just focused on the gritty reality of like these people walking around in the mud and shit.
Right. I mean, obviously that shot got teased around on Twitter, which was, yeah, but
yes, the symbolism is obvious, but stuff like, you know,
well,
go
the
ahead.
joke I made that I was like being joking, but also being like, yeah, it doesn't mean it's bad, is the rat in The Departed.
Yeah, exactly.
It's, it's that kind of thing. Like that's exactly, it's like, yeah, yes, the rat symbolizes obviousness, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad.
Right. It's making a very, very blunt statement through metaphor. And it's, I think, always better to do it through metaphor than to say it directly in the text of the, whatever it is that you're viewing. So I think being able to find those fantastic genre type images was a real step forward for the show, because it failed to do that, I think, through a lot of its running time, because it was just so focused on being a character drama that took place in dim hallways and, muddy forests and stuff. There's just so much of that crap. Like even things like the shadow killer that whatever, the red lady, whatever her name is, gives birth to, that kills Renly Baratheon. It's like, this is too dim. They're not making this look cool at all. It's hard to be invested. And the giants, I remember, and the whites were some of the most interesting things visually to look at. The dragons looked pretty cool eventually, and the visual effects for the dragons became incredible, I think. But episodes like Hard Home relied on this sort of chaos cinema, and everything just looked supremely chaotic instead of allowing action to be sort of framed in, like iconic ways. Sure, there were plenty of shots of like the White Walkers standing on cliffs on their zombie horses and they get a cool moody close up or something like that. But yeah, it's not nearly as fun as like that shot where Jon Snow walks out into that courtyard in King's Landing in the finale episode, and the dragon is sitting under this like mound of ash and snow, and it slowly reveals itself. It's like, man, that fucking shot is great.
No, that was cool. Something I want to speak on, because I think this has been part of the narrative with this last season, and it's a difficult thing to talk about. And I definitely saw somebody write about this, and I'm kicking myself for not knowing who it was and where it was published. But Game of Thrones, when it started in a very different climate than where it ended. And I think part of the reaction to the ending of the show, in specific where Dany's plot went, is if that's where it was going to go all along, okay, there's certainly an argument to be made throughout the show that that's where it was going. But because I think Dany had become, like you had said, this symbol of specifically oppressed women, but just people who feel oppressed, overthrowing a system that has, kept them under their thumb, that betrayal feels stronger because of where we are in our political and social climate today.
Certainly.
And I do take some, I don't want to say I take issue, but I can't really get on the bandwagon of feeling that means that artists and storytellers need to be these beacons of what you believe is social change, even if it's social change I agree with.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. Artists don't have a responsibility to be role models. Artists don't have a responsibility to echo what is popular sentiment, whether it be social stances or political stances or what have you. They're not necessarily responsible. But in sort of defense of the opposite standpoint, I don't know if David Benioff and DB Weiss owed us something that was more woke, because that's what you're getting at here. They didn't know it to us, but it would have been really nice to see. I mean, I know there are lots of shortcomings, particularly with the way that they ran their writers' room. The writers' room, I think, was way too homogenous and lacked the kind of varying perspectives that the show wanted to represent. The show wanted to represent various perspectives between lots of different characters. Why did you have a really, really homogenous writer's room then?
No, I completely agree with that. Like, even though I stand by what I say about, like, yeah, I don't think they need to make Danny this ultimate hero because that's the kind of thing that, a certain sect of people want to see reflected in real life. I'm also like, yeah, but you probably, it would have been a lot better, even if the storyline would have played out similarly or the same, to have different perspectives in the writer's room to help shape that journey in a way that, if not being more palatable, at least was more authentic.
Right. We're going from this period of, to be represented is nice, but to be properly represented is a different thing entirely. In no uncertain terms, if you want to write better women, hire women writers. If you want to write better people of color, hire writers who are people of color. You will get an authenticity in the perspective that, if you're not a woman, or if you're not a person of color, you're just not going to have the perspective to write those things. And I'm not saying that writers owe us that, but if it's something that they're setting out as a goal to achieve, to write, multidimensional women or multidimensional people of color, then, the obvious choice is to hire more women and hire more people of color. There it is. I don't want to say a whole lot more about it than that, because the unwokeness, I think, is just one of many, many, many issues people take with this decline in Game of Thrones.
Yes, I mean, it's well, like you said, it's easy to grasp onto that narrative,
right,
and make that, it's like, this is why it's so bad.
One thing we haven't talked about yet is George R.R. Martin, and eventually the show overtook his book series in terms of the timeline. Eventually, there were no more books to adapt, and I think people saw that as a pretty easy jumping off point to say, oh, well, this is where the show went to shit, is when they didn't have any more books.
Right. Oh, that's another common refrain.
And this is more auteur theory nonsense, I think.
Well, especially because I think they're acting like all of a sudden George R.R. Martin had nothing to do with the show after they ran out of the material of his to adapt. And it's like, I doubt I feel he had very little to do with the show in general.
I can't speak to George R.R. Martin's level of involvement in the show.
I mean, I can. There was the actor who plays Bran talked about, they had one meeting, Benioff and Weiss, with Martin, and it was basically like, here is the big picture ending. And that was it as far as the endings. He was like, here's the big picture stuff. This is kind of the route I'm going. The specifics are going to be different, but this is kind of the big points you need to know. And that was it. That was his entire involvement, at least in where the show was going to go for its ending. And from what I can tell and what I can deduce, that was kind of how they approached it fully. Was like, yeah, they would have a meeting with George and talk about their approach, and he would say, this is where things are going, these are the big moments, this is what yada yada yada, and then that was it. So I think this is another issue that's a bigger conversation about what adaptation is and why certain people feel adaptation owes them something.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, no, I don't, I'm the same way. It's like, well, if somebody's adapting something, they're bringing their own spin and their own take on it. And the only thing that they owe the audience is themselves, like, is their version of it.
Sure, but people were so invested in that version for so long.
Yes, and I think that's why it became an easy target to say, well, we hate this Game of Thrones thing because this isn't the real Game of Thrones. It's the books, and it's like, yeah, so the books are there. Like, read the books.
Right, and I think people have quite a bit of worry. These people that desperately want another book, people have a lot of worry about whether or not George R. R. Martin's actually going to do it.
Well, I don't even want to get into that discussion.
Yeah, because there's a good chance he's not going to finish the series. Let's just put it that way. But
yes, but I think talking about adaptations specifically, I think one of the reasons that the MCU has been so successful is they decidedly were like, these are not adaptations. Like, we're not taking a specific story and doing it. Like,
right.
we're just
they
going
lift things from here and there, but
yes, but by saying, because they had a movie called Civil War, but nobody was like, this isn't like the Civil War comic book, I hate it, because they had established that no, we're just taking these action figures and putting them in our own, in the sandboxes and toy chests of our own creation.
Right. There's an Age of Ultron comic series, and then there's an Age of Ultron movie. They don't really have much to do with one another. I mean, is it an adaptation? Certainly. It would definitely be considered an adapted screenplay and instead of an original screenplay. But it doesn't owe a whole lot to the structure of the comic. And that's okay. People were just fine with it.
And that's what I think the difference with Game of Thrones is that it's viewed more biblically, I should say, in terms of like, no, you need to adapt the words the way they should be done. And I think that argument falls apart because clearly at some point, even when they had George R. R. Martin's material to work with, they diverted their paths fairly early on, I feel.
They had to, and it was stuff like, you would read listicles years ago that was like, did you know that Dario Naharis in the book has like a triple pointed beard and blue hair? And I'm like, I don't give a shit.
Right.
Dario on the show is played by two just normal looking dudes, and I don't care.
Exactly. So I think the argument of it as adaptation, I can't get on board with, because I'm like, well, one, obviously I don't have anything invested in that personally, but two, you need to realize that adaptation is it's not mimicry. Like, it's not trying to be this thing that you have your own set of feelings towards.
And it's not always for you.
Yes, that's a good point too.
You might have loved the book, but this adaptation is not necessarily for you.
No, it was clearly made to be the biggest, most, pop culture grabbing thing that could exist. And that means that it's going to be very different.
Mm-hmm. And much more sort of broadly appealing. Like, it's not going to have characters with wacky blue hair and tri-pointy beards because the show just has commitment to a more grounded aesthetic. Overall, I'm really glad that the conversation about Game of Thrones has died down enough now that we can kind of put this out there. But I really do think that fans kind of set themselves up in a lot of ways for this sort of stuff. And I'm not trying to be some sort of high-minded, highfalutin, sham on you fans kind of guy all the time, but sometimes I think some fans need to bear responsibility for managing not just their expectations, but managing their relationships with these things.
Mm-hmm. Oh, managing attachment. Absolutely. I mean, it's something that it's very difficult to tell somebody like, hey, this thing you love, you need to not love it as much. And it's like, that's not what we're saying. But if you're the kind of person that feels so betrayed by a piece of art that you want to create or sign a petition to devalue and erase that.
I don't put a whole lot of value in these petitions, because it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to sign a petition, and most people are doing it to sort of take part in a meme.
That too, but at the same time, that mindset, and there's been, because this kind of stuff is happening more and more in pop culture, where if people feel they are loud enough about their displeasure, they feel like they can change things. Look at Mass Effect 3.
Look at Sonic the Hedgehog.
Look at Sonic the Hedgehog. These things are setting, I think, very scary precedents.
Well, and what do directors go out and say? This isn't for the critics. This is for the fans. This is for you. This is yours. This belongs to you.
Oh, everybody
that sense of fan ownership is very, very bad.
Everybody's contributing to this abusive relationship. Like, it's not one-sided. Don't don't misquote me on that.
Sure, but that's like, this belongs to the fans is such a pander bait thing to say. It kills me every time someone involved in a film production says it.
Well, and it's also just become, a shield for whenever movies don't do well with a critical audience or anything. They're like, well, we didn't make it for critics. And it's like, critics are people. Did you make this for people? Like, is it,
critics are also snobs, though, and most movies just aren't made for snobs, and that's fine.
That's fine too. But
I say with full comfort knowing that I'm a critic and a snob. I get it. It's okay.
but I think I agree that I'm glad the conversation around Game of Thrones has died down. I'll be very interested to see 10 years from now, what the discussion's going to be about it. Because the other thing, and this is something I've been wanting to put down in some way, is that the ending of Game of Thrones is not the ending of Game of Thrones. Like they have like 70 billion spin-off shows they're trying to make. Mm-hmm. Game of Thrones will continue on. I'm sure, like George R.R. Martin's test tube clone will end up writing like a whole new series of books, just like Christopher Tolkien and Frank Herbert's kid. They did that with their...
I would hate to be the son of a famous fantasy author, I tell you.
Right? So...
I got to pick up this fucking massive tome and finish it for you, Dad.
And keep expanding it. It's like... So... There's going to be more Game of Thrones stuff, but this idea this year of like Avengers Endgame, Game of Thrones, and Star Wars pretending that this is the ending of something.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, these things will continue on way past our lifetimes.
Well, where Star Wars is taking better strides with this kind of stuff, and it's still pissing off fans because fans will find any reason to be pissed off, is that it's very, very dangerous to write new things. Because new things are not familiar.
Right.
And this happened with Last Jedi, where they took some things and did some very bold actions, and people were not happy because they took things that people liked and did things with them that they didn't like. And it's easier to go backwards in time and just fill in little spots. It's like, oh, yeah, this is something I already know. And you're just, filling in little details and things that I can know and details that I can hoard as a nerd, which I do too. So I'm not trying to blame anybody for that. But it makes for movies like Rogue One, which is serviceable in many ways, but ultimately has no impact on greater storytelling. These new sequel Star Wars movies, they've been doing a good job, particularly in Last Jedi and potentially in Rise of Skywalker, at creating new lore and moving things forward and actually saying, we can put some distance between old stuff and new stuff. It's okay. As soon as that happened with Game of Thrones, where they were just sort of off book and making things up as they went along, people went, no, it's new. There's nothing, predestined here, nothing pre-written.
Right, exactly. Like,
and now they're going to do prequels, which is all just filling in stuff that happened before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which I have less than zero interest in. I just don't care. I mean, that's part of it too, is I think when we talked about investment, like people need to manage their investment in things. People get so invested in these things. And you and I had the benefit of being like, yeah, I'm sure. I mean, now, this is stuff that gets used derogatory wise. People are called, casuals, filthy casuals and things like that. And it's like, yeah, but maybe that mindset is better for a lot of people. Like, because you can still be passionate and knowledgeable and into a thing without feeling like it's personally attacking you.
Right. Yeah. I heard somebody say earlier today, it was a writer who was making a podcast that I really like. She said she felt personally attacked by the end of Lost. And I thought, well, I'm sorry you feel that way. You know what I mean? Like I had nothing better to say other than I'm sorry you feel that way. But the reality is it's just a TV show. And if you've incorporated it as part of your identity, it's on you. I think some responsibility is on managing that relationship between you and the thing. The thing has to stay external. It is a non-you thing.
So yeah, I mean, this became a lot bigger than just talking about the final season of Game of Thrones, but at the end of the day, it's an achievement. Like, I don't think anybody can take that away.
I took a dump this morning that I would call an achievement.
Well, sure. Well, I mean, achievements aren't necessarily on a scale, so to speak. Like, they did something that really captured the zeitgeist and that has pushed the medium of serialized television storytelling and budgets and all this stuff, for good or ill. That's the thing that people, it's like, it can be both. It can be neither. Like, it's more than just that. And for that, like, I'm happy Game of Thrones existed. I hope that Game of Thrones inspires somebody to do the next Game of Thrones. That doesn't mean the next, hard, gritty fantasy story with big CGI dragons. It's the next thing that really captures our imagination and our commitment to characters and drama. And when that thing comes around, when it ends, get ready to hear the same things crop up again, because it's cyclical. It's always going to happen this way. And I think that's something you can only learn having experience. Like, I think about a lot of younger viewers and readers and stuff of Game of Thrones that went through this, who didn't experience Lost, like to talk about Lost. And it's like, yeah, I felt just as, I was so invested in Lost, and I was like, how could they do this? This isn't, successful. And now that I had distance, that I've seen those reactions come up with other things again, I'm like, oh yeah, it really wasn't that big of a deal.
No, it was a whiff. I think that ending of Lost was a pretty big whiff, but
yeah. And
ultimately, was I hurt by it? No, I'm fine today. Thanks.
Exactly.
Well, I don't know about fine, but it wasn't Lost's fault.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't Lost who did this to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, Game of Thrones, I hope you enjoyed it. If you didn't, feel free.
I'm sorry you feel that way.
Yeah. Sorry you feel that way.
One of the big reasons I wanted to delay me talking about this is that I sound like a real asshole. I feel like a real asshole because I sound like an asshole when I say, like, man, I wish I had the energy some of y'all had to be mad at a TV show.
Right.
Which is a very asshole thing to say, because I know just how strong these feelings are. And I know just how strong these parasocial relationships are that people develop. But I also feel like maybe don't get that invested in it. Like, I'm not all that invested in it. I watch that motherfucker every week. I wasn't that invested in it.
Well, like we said, I think this just comes down to being able to set limitations and manage your investment. I don't think either of us are saying don't love things. It's just understand how to love things. Understand how to love something and how to engage with it positively and negatively. Like, it's both sides, because there's people who you can be just as crazy and fanatical about something positively and it's just as bad.
Yeah, well, and often the pendulum swings. People love something so much that they end up really, really hating it. And this is what happened with Game of Thrones, And even though you might learn to manage your expectations about something, or manage your relationship with a property, or manage your parasocial relationships with the characters that you love, doesn't necessarily make season 8 of Game of Thrones any better. But maybe you won't be so mad about it.
No. That said, second episode, Night of the Seven Kingdoms, it's one of the best of the series.
Yes, it was.
So there you go. That's all I wanted to go out on. So thank you all for listening. I'm sure you will have comments for us, so feel free to comment either on GenreVision.com or here on the YouTube page.
If you did like what we did today, please check us out at GenreVision.com. We have several different podcasts available for you there. We have our normal weekly GenreVision podcast, which is a film review show. We've got FinFlix, which is our shark movie show. And then there's Third Time's the Charm, which talks about third movies in series. And it talks a little bit about some of the management of expectations about endings and things like that we touched on today. So check us out. We'll be back with you soon.
Bye.